Robin Bartlett, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Robin, it's an honor to have you on. For our listeners who may not be familiar with you and your work, who are you and what do you do?
Well, Joe, I am a Vietnam veteran, and I recently wrote a book called Vietnam Combat: Firefights and Writing History. I come from a military family. My grandfather went to West Point. My father went to West Point. My brother went to West Point. And I actually turned down an appointment to West Point because at the age of 18, I had attended 13 elementary and middle schools and 4 high schools. And I said, that is enough of the military for me. But as I entered college in Southern California, it was the buildup of the Vietnam War. And some of my classmates actually got reclassified during the summer. And there was a tradition in my family of serving as an officer, and we took service to our country very, very seriously. So I went into the ROTC program, came out as a distinguished military graduate, and at the ripe age of 21, with a college degree, knowing everything there was to know, I decided to volunteer for the most challenging thing that I could think of, and that was Airborne, Ranger, and assignment to the 82nd Airborne Division as a paratrooper. And I got everything that I asked for and more.
Wow. I want to get into your book, Vietnam Combat: Firefights and Writing History. And I'm going to do my best to ask good questions and get out of the way and let your story tell itself. But before we do that, I want to start back all the way from the beginning. Where'd you grow up?
Well, that's a good question. I was in a military family, and we lived all over the United States and Europe. I was born in California, so I sort of feel like California was my home. But the longest period of time I ever spent in California was the 4 years that I went to college in Southern California.
From walking away from West Point, how'd you get the itch to go 82nd Airborne Ranger? That's a big turnaround. How'd that happen?
Well, I went through the ROTC program. And
so what made you do that? So ROTC, what made you do ROTC when you walked away from West Point?
I did not wish to be drafted, and there was a family tradition that you would serve as an officer. My family took military service very, very seriously. The words "in service to our country" actually were very, very meaningful to us. If we were asked, what does your father do? I would say he's in service to our country. Yeah. So again, military tradition for 3 generations. And I did not wish to go on to graduate school, and I did not wish to be drafted. It was the height of the Vietnam War, and I went through the ROTC program. It was second nature to me. When I graduated, I kind of had a little talk to Jesus moment and said, you've never done anything that's been terribly challenging in your life. What can you think of that is the most challenging thing you could do? Mm-hmm. And that's what I chose. Plus, I volunteered to go infantry. So I was infantry officer, second lieutenant, commissioned on the same day that I graduated. And 2 days later, with everything in my car, I was driving across the United States to go to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, home of the 82nd Airborne Division.
Wow. You get to Fort Bragg. Take us from there.
I was at Fort Bragg, North Carolina for about 4 to 5 weeks waiting for orders, sending me down to Fort Benning, Georgia to jump school. And at the time I was what they call a leg, meaning I was not jump qualified. And my company commander had the foresight not to assign me as a platoon leader because all of my men would have been jump qualified and I was not. So I worked in his office and learned some of the ropes. I graduated from jump school. That's 4 weeks long. Then I went through infantry officers basic course, which was 8 weeks long, and then Ranger school. And I was in the same class as the graduating infantry officers from West Point, all of whom were in a very tight clique. And so we had the distinguished military graduates out of ROTC, and we had the graduating infantry class out of West Point. So it was quite an interesting dichotomy of two different groups of people, and not a lot of respect going either way.
So is the training hard enough, and is the training engaged enough where at some point those boundaries fall and you guys start integrating and respecting each other? Or does that happen during training?
No, it did not. And part of the training was something called a buddy rating. And the members of your squad would rate one another. And after the first quarter of Ranger School, I was in danger of failing the course because I was poorly rated by the West Pointers. The good thing that happened to me is that I came down with bronchial pneumonia and I got recycled to the next course, next class of Ranger School. And that class was the artillery officers out of West Point. And then I had a little bit of knowledge about what was coming at us. So I was the expert and knew when to volunteer and when not to volunteer. Plus the artillery officers were a little less gung-ho than the infantry officers. So we got along very, very well. And there was much more camaraderie with that group than with the West Point infantry officers. And I would say, generally speaking, that continued on throughout the entire time that I was in the service. West Pointers stick to themselves. They're called ring knockers.
Ring knock.
Ring knockers. That's right. They all wear their West Point rings.
Do you remember the point when they told you Ranger School was over and you got the Ranger tag?
I remember it like it was yesterday. It was an emotional moment for me. It was it was the most challenging thing I think that I have ever done in my life. It was the most physically and mentally demanding course that the Army has to offer still to this day. I think that SEAL training is perhaps more demanding physically, but the Ranger School took you to the point of physical and mental exhaustion. And then when you reached that point, that's when they put you in charge and said, take over and lead the unit. And it was a proud moment when our Ranger Sergeant, who was in charge of our unit, pinned that Ranger tab on my shoulder, and I still have that tab to this day.
That's awesome. So let's get to your book. All right. So chapter 1, great first title. It starts off, my first worst day in Vietnam. So you graduate Ranger School. How soon from Ranger School do you head off to Nam? What's the time frame?
So I came back to the 82nd Airborne Division, made 32 jumps. An officer had to jump at least once a month. And I went through a pretty rigorous program with the 82nd and received orders transferring me to the 101st Airborne Division. They wanted to keep airborne officers in airborne units. So I went to Vietnam thinking that I was going to be joining the 101st Airborne Division. When I arrived in Vietnam, it was right after the Tet Offensive of 1968, which was the turning point of the war, both for within the United States and also in Vietnam. The U.S. suffered substantial casualties, but nowhere near the number of casualties that we inflicted on the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army. It was certainly 10-1, but it did change the attitude and the opinion of the American public. And because of the casualties of officers especially, I was told at the replacement depot that all orders were canceled and just to stand by. So 3 days later, I was assigned to the 1st Cavalry Division. And this is the Airmobile Division. And that was the strategy that this particular division followed throughout the war. We had more helicopters in that division than in all of Vietnam. And the concept of the Airmobile concept was simply that you brought fresh troops to the scene of the battle by helicopter into landing zones, as opposed to having them have walked through the jungle or to the battle. You arrived with fresh troops by helicopter. Sometimes those landing zones were hot.
So let's go to the book. Vietnam firefights, chapter 1. My first worst day in Vietnam.
That's a discussion about, well, first of all, we were able to carry lighter weight packs than my comrades in other divisions because we were able to carry more water, more ammunition, and because we got resupplied by helicopter practically every day. And that was a plus. My pack weighed about 45 pounds compared to some of my other officers who would carry 70 pounds, 75 pounds. Acclimatization was a key factor in the first 3 weeks of Vietnam because the average temperature was 105, and occasionally it got up to 115. So after a 3-week period, you began to adjust to the heat. As I took over my platoon of between 28 and 32 men, there was a period of time for all new soldiers coming in, officers included. You were an FNG. That's a F a new guy. And you were an F a new guy until you got acclimatized and you learned the protocols of the 1st Cav Division and the units that we were assigned to. I had a soldier come into my unit who was a Sergeant E5, and he had the rank technically of being the squad leader. My squad leaders were all SP4s. That's one rank below the sergeant. And this sergeant had gone through a 6-month course at Fort Benning, Georgia, which was called the Instant NCO course. And he was gung-ho. He wanted to get his kill. He wanted to get his medals. He carried way too much weight on his back. And we tried to get him to lighten his load. We tried to get him oriented toward the way we did things, but he wanted to take over. He wanted to be in charge. He was gung-ho. First thing he did with me when he showed up in my unit was salute me. And I told him, make that the last salute you ever give me. And don't you ever call me sir. You know, a platoon leader's life expectancy in Vietnam was 90 days.
Wow.
And I could talk about the reasons why I think I survived those 90 days. But this soldier, Roberts, just wouldn't quit. But I refused to make him a squad leader until I felt more confident that he could lead a squad. My other squad leaders had much more time in the field and experience. So one of the squads was to go out on a patrol, and he volunteered to go with him, with that patrol. He wanted the experience. And I said, okay, you can go, but you are not the leader, and you will take orders from the squad leader. And he agreed to do that. They got into a sniper activity, and this soldier stood up, ran directly at the sniper with a hand grenade, thinking that he could knock out the sniper, and the sniper shot him in the head.
Wow.
So the men brought him back to me, carried him back, and it is the officer's responsibility to take care of the body. And that meant searching the pockets, making sure there was, anything personal needed to come out of the pockets and put in a plastic bag to go back to the battalion headquarters. And my medic gave me what we called a death card, which was basically a 3x5 card with a hole punched in it and a piece of string. Okay. And for the first time, the Army actually wrote down the coordinates where soldiers, as close as you could estimate, where soldiers were actually killed. So they were able to track pretty accurately where those soldiers had died. And it was my job to put that card on his boot, along with a dog tag. The other dog tag remained around his neck, filled out the card. And we didn't have body bags, we had ponchos. So we wrapped him in his poncho. And I had a ball of twine because the ponchos would flap around when the helicopters came in to deliver logistic supplies. And that's when we would put the body back on to the helicopter to go back to the rear. And I would tie off the poncho around the head and the waist and the feet so that it wouldn't flap around. That was my first KIA, killed in action. Wow. It would not be my last, but because it was the first, it really was a traumatic experience, one I'll never forget.
What goes through your mind? Did you see him get shot, or did you realize it when they brought the body back to you?
I realized it when they brought the body back. I did not go on that patrol.
And when you see that particular person who you thought may get himself in trouble with the way, just how aggressive they were, what goes through your mind when you see that person come back?
He fit the mold of being super gung ho, and that was just not a very good way to be in that combat environment that we were in. You had to act as a team, and you had to act, especially if you were in a leadership situation. Could not afford to be a John Wayne type of individual. It just was not healthy. He wouldn't survive, and he did not.
Taking it even a step back further, when you first got off the plane and you landed in Vietnam, what were your initial impressions? Was it what you thought? How was it like, and how was it different than what you trained for and what you thought about getting in there?
I was scared shitless. I was scared. I was on a flight of mostly second lieutenants, all of whom who had just about 1 year in service. And none of us knew where we were going. I mean, because all of the casualties as a result of the Tet Offensive of 68, we all got reassigned. Some went on to the 101st. I did not. And then we all went to different units and had different experiences. And so all of the people that I knew from the 82nd, I lost all those relationships. Mm-hmm. Ended up with 3 other officers who came to my battalion. Went through acclimatization and some refresher training, and then ultimately were assigned to my battalion, the 1st Battalion of 5th Cavalry Regiment. And on the day we met our battalion commander, we were all promoted to 1st Lieutenant. So after 1 year, I was promoted to 1st Lieutenant. Mm-hmm. By comparison, it took my brother 4 years, took my father 8 years to make 1st Lieutenant.
Wow.
But that was because of the casualties and the need for officers. So there were 4 officers who went into the battalion commander's bunker on that day. And we went in alphabetical order. So I went in first. And the battalion commander was literally dead on his feet. I don't think he'd slept in 2 days. Wow. And he gave us the 2-minute prep talk. I don't remember anything that he said. He said to the S1, who is the personnel officer, "Where do we need these officers?" And he said, the S1 said, "Well, we need 1 in A, 2 in B, and 1 in C." So that's how I got assigned to A Company. And of those 4 officers, I was the only one to complete my tour. The other 3 officers were either killed or wounded. So luck of alphabetical order, I guess.
Wow. I guess at some point luck plays a role, right? I mean,
it does.
All the training, all the amazing training, Ranger, Airborne, you're probably as well trained as anyone there, but luck plays a factor, doesn't it?
Well, it does. And I think I did 3 things that helped me to survive my tour.
What are they?
Well, number 1 was I tried very, very hard not to do stupid stuff.
Okay.
And believe it or not, it's
Good
easy
idea.
to do stupid stuff.
Don't do the stupid stuff. Give me an idea.
Well, I had a fellow officer who had been in the 82nd Airborne Division, and he was calling in a helicopter, landing a helicopter in a landing zone. And you give hand signals to the pilot because he can't really see the dimensions of the landing zone. So you're giving hand signals, and he stood on a mound. He stood on a mound as the helicopter landed. Not a smart thing to do because the helicopter blades just took off his head.
No.
Yes. So number 2, when I joined my platoon, my company, and met my platoon sergeants and squad leaders, I sat down with them and I said, "You guys have been in the field longer than I have. I'm still going to be the leader, but I want you to tell me if you think I'm doing something wrong. And I want your advice and I want your input. Now, I may not agree with you, but I want you to feel comfortable and confident to tell me, especially if you have feelings about whatever it is we're doing that you think might be wrong or there's a better way." And then number 3, and perhaps the most important, is that I trusted my point man and cover man, because we were operating primarily near the Laotian border. And this was jungle, 3 canopy jungle,
Yeah.
single file, cutting your way through dense underbrush. And if the point man and cover man alerted or felt uncomfortable, if there were no birds singing, if there were no monkeys chirping, they would call me forward, and I trusted their intuition. And what I ended up doing was something called reconnaissance by fire. So I fired artillery rounds up in front of us to where we were going to be walking through. And I fired so much artillery that the battery that supported us put a budget of 25 rounds on me. I could not shoot more than 25 rounds, but that was
Wow.
enough. That was sufficient to make my platoon feel comfortable about going through an area that just didn't seem right.
Wow, that's phenomenal. So that 25, now is that 25 rounds a day or per mission, or what was that?
Per
20
mission.
Per
Per
mission.
mission,
And
yeah.
how long would a mission last?
Well, it essentially every day, each platoon would go out on and cover an area of maybe 5 to 8 kilometers from the night defensive position. So each
Okay.
platoon would go in, 1/3 of a circle. And it would depend a great deal upon what the terrain was like. You might be going up and down a mountain. You might be walking through a stream bed. It might take you 2 or 3 hours. It might take you 5 or 6.
Wow. So just to recap there, the 3 things you said that kept you safe, the reason why you survived and we're speaking right now. 1, don't do stupid stuff. I mean,
Right.
that's phenomenal. You can bring that, you can give that, that's great parenting advice. That's great advice for business. Don't do stupid stuff. Oh my gosh, that's phenomenal. And the number 2, you basically went on like a listening tour, like advice. Like you said, hey, you've been here longer than me. I just got here.
I listened to my subordinates.
You listened to maybe somebody was there for a year already, right? They were there for 10
Well,
months.
certainly longer than I was.
Yes. That's great
My
advice.
platoon sergeant was supposed to be the most experienced man in the unit. Typically, a platoon sergeant has between about 10 years of service.
Okay.
My platoon sergeant was an instant NCO. He went through a 6-month course, came out as a Sergeant E6, and he had about as much training as I did.
Oh, wow.
So, and he had his 18th birthday in Vietnam. I was 22.
Oh my gosh. So it's an 18-year-old.
I was the second oldest man in my unit. The old man was 24.
My goodness. And you forget that. Like watching a war movie or reading a war book, you forget like they're 18, 19, 20-year-old kids doing this. That is amazing.
90% of my platoon were draftees. 10% were volunteers. So they were mostly draftees.
Okay, and I want to get back to the 90% draftees in a second, but just the third point you make, trust your point and cover people. I love
That's
your
right.
thought, like you're walking through the jungle and you hear no birds chirping. I'm like, my goodness, I never thought of that, but now that makes so much sense. Like there's something going on that's someone somewhere that makes the bird stop chirping.
It could also be smells. It could be smells. We walked into an enemy base camp and we discovered it because my point man stepped in the latrine.
Oh my gosh, really?
That's how we discovered that we were in an enemy base camp.
And how far, when you step in the latrine, how far are you from contact with the enemy?
Well, fortunately, in this particular case, they had already left.
Okay.
We just discovered their camp.
Gotcha. Oh my gosh, that is wild. And like when you step there, can you know and you stop and look around? Can you see? Oh, this is a camp, or you still couldn't tell once you stepped? Like, is it?
Well, listen. When you encounter a latrine, you know it.
You know that. Yeah,
there's something going on here because people don't dig latrines in the middle of the jungle.
That is wow. And then you mentioned 90% drafted, 10%.
10% volunteers.
Volunteers. Of that 90%, this is me just reading books and talking to veterans, is there a higher percentage of that 90% that don't want to be there, not really on board, they just want to get home, where you're not volunteering for that? Maybe they're forced to be there. You see maybe that they're not maybe your ideal partner in a firefight situation. And is that true or not true? That not say fallacy.
In my case, I think, anyone who was drafted at that period of time, just as I did, knew where they were headed for. And what you wanted to do was get as much training and much expertise as possible to survive your tour.
Gotcha.
An officer only had to spend 6 to 7 months in the field. Then you took over a staff job. However, a grunt, a soldier, was there for 12 months. After 11, many of them started to get kind of squirrely.
Yeah.
So we would let them go back to the rear and for the last month, and they'd find something for them to do.
Wow. You mentioned about artillery. You were on the 25 round limit. How many times did you shoot artillery and you're like, thank God I did, because there was bad news ahead for us? Could you tell when that would happen?
Occasionally we would find blood trails as we went through the area. The main reason I did that was to reassure my men, especially the point man, and sometimes it would just be an uneasy feeling. Mm-hmm. You had to trust that intuitive feelings that these men would have, because they're walking at the front of the line, single file. They are in the worst position possible, next to me perhaps, because I'm walking with the radio operator right behind me and a map in my pocket. So I'm a target as well.
When you're going through triple canopy jungle and they're cutting literally with the machete, right? They're just cutting through with the, how many times do snakes pop out or something like that? Like how common is that when you're cutting through the jungle and just you cut and there's something crazy's in front of you?
It would happen. Often the point man would trip and fall, and he was the only one that carried his weapon on full automatic. And he'd trip and fall and pull the trigger. And then, of course, everybody would hit the ground thinking that he was being ambushed, but it was just a trip and fall. But really, in the deep jungle like that, you have a problem with humidity, intense humidity. So if you had 100, 105 degree temperature, you had to rotate the point man every 15 minutes or so. Otherwise, they would just keel over and with heat exhaustion or heat stroke.
Well, I'm sure there's so many badasses there where the person doesn't want to give up point, even though you see they're fried. How did you handle stuff like that? Where maybe they're done, but they're like, no, I'm fine. What do you do?
No,
we just, in that situation?
We just rotated it. Every man in the unit took his turn at point.
Okay, wow.
And we rotated it among the squads as well. So the first squad would have it one day, and then the second squad would have it the next day, and the third squad would have it the third day, and just kept rotating.
Gotcha. How fast do you build camaraderie and like interactions when you're in that intense of an environment, right? Even if you're from West Point or you're in ROTC, you're from Texas, you're from Maine, you're from Philly, you're from California, like pretty soon you develop a pretty strong bond, right? Like how quick does that happen?
Well, it didn't, to be honest with you. As an officer, we did not call each other by our names. Everybody had either a nickname. My name was, my call sign was Foggy Day 16. So my men would call me 16, or they would call me LT. The only way you knew I was an officer was on the camouflage hat band that was around my helmet. It said LT Bartlett, written in pen. The only men that I got to know, even somewhat remotely, was my platoon sergeant, my radio operator, and my medic. And my medic and my radio operator actually reviewed my book. But they're the only ones that I got even remotely close to. An officer could not afford to get close to his men, because when the bullets flew, if you were ambushed or if you ambushed the enemy, couldn't afford not to be able to say to your men, to give them direction. And sometimes that put them in harm's way. Mm-hmm. You just could not afford to be close to someone or to have close relationships.
Looking back, do you think that was a good idea or an idea you probably could have optimized. You think that was the way to go, or if you had to do it again, would you try to get closer to the men or not?
Well, that was the training that we received, both in
Mhm.
Ranger School and upon introduction to the division and to the refresher training that we received. We were told not to get close to our men.
Okay, no, understood. You mentioned you're in the triple canopy jungle, you're on patrols. What were some of the most maybe intense combat situations you experienced, and like how'd your unit handle them?
So in dense jungle like that, if you had a man who either had heat exhaustion or heat stroke, I had one man who was actually shot through the throat and was bleeding to death. And you're in three canopy jungle, and you could know approximately where you were on the map. And I called for medevac, but we had to cut down about 10 or 15 trees with a machete to open up a hole that was 10 to 12 feet in diameter, so that if you popped smoke, the smoke would just simply go up and hang in the trees.
Wow.
And the helicopter would not be able to spot you. So we had what was called a star cluster, which is a little bit like a Roman candle.
Mm-hmm.
And you'd fire this Roman candle through the hole in the canopy, and you just pray that pilot or door gunners or crew chief would see you and come over and drop what he called a jungle penetrator, which was basically a hook. And if the man could sit on the seat at the end of the hook, you tied him onto the seat. In this case, the man could not sit on the seat, so they dropped a stretcher and came back over the hole, dropped the hook, and then we just tied the stretcher to the hook and they hauled him up.
Wow. So literally he's being lifted through the hole in the canopy up into the helicopter. My goodness, man. How exposed are they? If you're like in a firefight situation and you're dangling slowly up into a helicopter, that's a pretty big target, isn't it?
Not in three canopy jungle. No, we had pulled back from the contact. I had my men positioned to continue the firefight while I worked with the medic and one other man to get this wounded soldier out, because he was bleeding to death. And if we didn't get him out, he would have died.
Wow. That is.
So it was a question of whether I continued the contact and continued to try to overcome the enemy or to save this man's life.
Right. Can you describe another situation that maybe you didn't train for, but experienced, and how'd you handle it?
So Ranger School was the best insurance policy any officer could have. And as I mentioned before, they took you to the point of physical and mental exhaustion. And they taught you to be totally courageous. And to this day, my wife says to me, your greatest strength is that you are fearless, and your greatest weakness is that you are fearless. But they taught us to be fearless. And when the bullets are flying overhead, you just drop to the ground and you bury your head in the dirt and you pray. But as the leader, literally all eyes are on you, waiting for instructions, waiting for direction, right or wrong. They want you to take command and to give direction, give orders. Sometimes that put men in harm's way. And there were several situations where we were ambushed and we had to overcome the enemy or die. And it was necessary to have men attack the enemy intelligently as possible.
Were there any specific tactics or strategies you found especially effective that got you prepared for what you experienced in the jungle?
Mostly it was the physical preparation, and there was never really one occasion in Vietnam when I felt like I wasn't physically able to be in command of the situation, that I was in many cases better physically fit than my men were. And sometimes I had to be very cautious about that because the intense heat. But training wise, I don't know. I think there were a lot of just little techniques, little steps that little ideas that I employed. I carried some rope. It came in very, very handy on a number of occasions to help us out of situations. Plastic bags, I carried plastic bags that came in handy, but I can't think of anything very specific that I wasn't prepared for. In fact, I felt like for the most part, I was very well prepared to lead that unit.
What's the worst situation you can remember finding yourself in? Is there a situation where you had your your oh crap moment, like, oh wow, this might be it, I might not survive this?
Well, as I mentioned before, every platoon sent out an ambush every night. So I would take out one night and my platoon sergeant would take out another night. Now, we knew that the enemy soldiers were monitoring us. They were always observing us. So in choosing an ambush location, we always made a fuss over 2 or 3 different places so that they really wouldn't know which one we ended up choosing. Mm-hmm. And on this one particular evening, it was my turn to lead the unit, and we had to cross a rice paddy. The protocol to be followed was you send 2 men across to the other side of the rice paddy. They check out the far side, and then they give you a quick 2 little blips on their flashlight with a red filter on it. And then you send your men across. And somehow I thought I had done everything by the book, and perhaps that was the problem, because when my men got totally exposed along the rice paddy, they opened up on us with automatic weapons fire and mortars. And several of my men were a couple killed right off the bat, and others were wounded. And I immediately called for artillery support, which was my standard weapon of choice. And as the first rounds came over, I put my arm up on top of the rice paddy dike, which is like concrete. And a mortar round went off on the other side of the rice paddy dike. And a piece of shrapnel caught me in the shoulder and kicked me back. I lost my helmet and kind of dazed me. And I got up on my knees and I noticed that all the tracer rounds were going away from me. And I realized that I had my back to the contact. And about that time, another mortar round went off in front of me. But fortunately, it was a muddy, watery area. So the round exploded after it had penetrated the mud and the ground. So I got sprayed with all this. I did catch some more shrapnel, but I got sprayed with all this dirt and mud, and it kicked me back, and I hit my head on the rice paddy dike, and I was out. I was knocked out. So my squad leader was able to pull me back and pulled all the wounded back and set up a defensive position. But I had blood all over my shoulder and my groin from the shrapnel wounds, and they thought I was dead.
Wow.
So I was put in the dead pile.
Really?
Yes.
While you were knocked out? While you were knocked out?
Yes. I was put in the dead pile.
But were you breathing? Like they checked your breath for a pulse, or?
Didn't have time to do that. Didn't have time to do that.
Wow.
I wasn't moving. I was dead. End of story. So after a while, I woke up and I sat up. But by this time, I'd lost a lot of blood and I fainted. And it's 10 o'clock at night, so nobody saw me. The second time I woke up, I moaned and somebody said, "Hey, he's not dead." And then they came over and they put bandages on me. But we weren't able to bring in any medevacs because they didn't want to risk the helicopters at night. So meanwhile, the rest of the company came over to support us, and we, attacked the enemy force. But I lay there on the ground from about 10 o'clock at night until 6 the next morning when the medevac could be brought in. And my wounds were not severe, but I had lost a lot of blood. And that was because they kept coming over to me and slapping me in the face to keep me awake and to keep me from going into shock.
Wow.
But I had...
Does that work? Smacking people in the face?
Yeah, it works.
Wow.
It works, especially if you get slapped hard enough.
Wow.
But I had a long talk with myself, and I decided at that point in time that if I should die right at that point in time, I really had not accomplished what I had, or let me say that I had more to accomplish with my life, and that if I died at that point, it would not be meaningful, and that was really the beginning of my own change of heart about the war and about what I was doing, and it was a traumatic moment for me and a cathartic moment for me as well.
Wow. So after that moment, you survived. Did they pull your dog tags off like they do when they thought you were dead?
No, because I woke up, they were able to stop the bleeding, and I just lay there until 6 the next morning when the medevacs came in to take the dead and the wounded out.
So when you get medevaced, how long were you in country before this particular event?
About 5 months.
5 months. So you get medevaced. Where do they medevac you to?
To a hospital ship on the Gulf of Tonkin.
Really? So you get, what were your injuries? Like, what were you dealing with after they checked you out? What
Shrapnel in my left shoulder and in my groin.
Had a concussion too, I take it? Like a concussion?
Yeah, just a bad headache. Really very, very bad headache.
I'm sure they would call that a concussion today, but okay. So how long were you on the ship for?
3 days.
Then what happens after that?
Light duty for 10.
Okay.
I wrote everybody up for awards and then back out to the field.
And then how much longer were you in the field after that?
A total of 7 months. 7 months in the field.
So you did 5 months and then you came back in another 2?
That's right.
Okay.
Well, I was out for about 15 days and then I came back to completed 7 months.
Now, something like that, when you get shrapnel medical ships, is that the Purple Heart? Do you win the Purple Heart?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Sure. Got 2 of them.
2 of them. Okay. So let's fast forward towards the end of your play. How do you know the end of your time in country is coming up?
We're at a night defensive position, and my company commander says, "Come to my CP command post." I walk over. He says, "Your replacement is inbound in a helicopter. You have 10 minutes to say goodbye to your men.
Whoa,
and you're going back to the rear as a staff person."
Did you know that was coming, or is that just total surprise?
No. Just that was I had 10 minutes to say goodbye to everybody, and they brought in a light observation helicopter. It's called a Loach, and it's a pilot and co-pilot and a seat in the back that would carry 1 or 2 men. I got in on one side, and my replacement got off on the other side, and then they flew me back to the battalion headquarters.
Did you guys like shake hands, fist bump,
No,
anything like that?
No,
say hello to each other?
Never met him. Never met him. Nothing.
He just gets out one side, you get in the other, and you're gone.
That's right. I gave my map. I gave my map to my platoon sergeant. Had a couple of other things that I just gave away because I was going back. I was going to be a staff officer. My specialty was my secondary specialty was the S1. That's the personnel officer.
When you get that 10 minutes, I'm leaving, right? Which goes through your mind? Excited, not excited, like surprised? What goes through your mind when they say, "Hey, you're out of here in 10 minutes"?
I had enough time to say goodbye to the platoon sergeant, give him my map. I gave my radio operator a couple of things that I was carrying that he always admired, and my rope. They wanted my rope, so I gave him my rope, and that was about it. I didn't have much time. I said goodbye to the squad leaders, shook hands, and that was it. That was pretty much it. I didn't say anything to the men.
And then of that group you left, did you keep in touch with anyone after the war in that group? Was that even possible? Like
there's actually a group called the Foggy Day Group, and these were all men who at one time or another were members of A Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Cav. And we have an email list, and we try to get together at 1st Cav reunions, the headquarters, the annual reunion of the 1st Cav Division. And there are about 70 of us who are on that list. But we weren't, some of them were, my medic was there and my radio operator is there. But these were all members of A Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Cav at one point in time with the call sign Foggy Day. So they call it the Foggy Day Group.
How often do you guys get together these days?
Just at the reunion of the 1st Cav. And then we have an email list that we send jokes to each other.
What's it like running into like your radio person or medic 40 years later? Like, what is that like?
Well, I've only been to one reunion, and it was pretty traumatic. I mean, it was pretty pretty tough. We shed some tears, and a lot of storytelling, a lot of drinking.
I bet. When you're taking off there, and then like I remember watching on YouTube the end of what's that great series back in the day, MASH, when they come up, and is it like that? Like you're taking off and you see everyone from below, and you're pulling away, almost like the Platoon scene when the helicopter's pulling away. Does it feel something like that?
Well, the nice thing about a helicopter combat assault is that it's the only time that you got to cool off. Because once you got up in the air, it was cool and comfortable for about 10 or 15 minutes until you got ready to go on the assault. And my platoon would lead every third assault. So I made 50 helicopter combat assaults during my time in Vietnam, and
Wow.
sometimes we even did it twice a day. Wow. When it was my platoon's turn to lead the assault, I always was in the first helicopter. I always went in heavy, 2 machine guns, M79 grenade launcher, radio operator, squad leader, ammo bearer. So I took as much heavy equipment as possible, but they would prep the LZ prior to landing. They would have an artillery preparation of about 5 minutes with a lot of artillery. And then we would be supported by at least 2 Cobra helicopters. They had rockets and minigun, and they would spray the perimeter. And they would remain on station after you landed in the event you hit a hot LZ. The enemy had a technique of waiting for the second helicopter. They'd let the first helicopter land, and the men would jump off and run for cover, but they would wait and then fire a rocket-propelled grenade at the second helicopter and cause it to crash. And they did that intentionally so that they could destroy that second helicopter, as well as the men who remained on the landing zone basically had to fight it out on their own, because they would not allow the additional choppers to land on a hot LZ. They would be directed to a nearby LZ and then try to come to support the men on the first LZ.
Man, it takes incredible courage all the way around. Oh my goodness. You leave combat after 7 months. How long were you in that administrative staff position?
So when I came into the battalion, I met with the S1, the personnel officer of the battalion. I told him that was my specialty. And he said to me, well, you'll be coming out of the field about the same time as I'll be going back to the world. That's what we called it. And so if you survive your tour, you can be the S1. So I survived my tour, and I was understudying the S1 for about 3 days on the job training. And on the third day, he came to me and said, "Did you apply for a job at division headquarters?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, I've gotten orders here for you to report for a job interview with the 14th MHD at division headquarters." And I said, "What is the 14th MHD?" And he said, "I don't know. Get on a helicopter and go back for your interview." So I got on a helicopter, landed at division headquarters, started asking around, does anybody know where the 14th MHD is? And finally, I found a soldier who said, "Well, I think it's down that road about a mile." So I walked down the road, and I finally came to a tent. And out in front, it had a sign that said 14th Military History Detachment. Motto, you fight it, we write it. And the captain who was in charge had gone through every personnel file of every officer in the division, every junior officer, looking for somebody who had journalism or literature background. And I did. That was my major in college. And I looked around this tent, and I saw a television set, a refrigerator with Coke and beer. I saw cots, and I saw a shower.
Wow.
He offered me the job, and I took it.
You took it after 7 months in the jungle. My goodness, you fight it, we write it. It reminds me of that scene in Full Metal Jacket where I think someone says you're going to be a writer, and he goes, "Who are you, Mickey effing Spillane?" Like that. Remember Gunny, Sergeant? You're not a writer, you're a killer. Wow, that's incredible. How long did you do the writing job for?
So I did that job for about 5 months. I was the division historian. We went to the division briefing every night, and our main responsibility was every quarter to write edit and prepare a division briefing, a division report on lessons learned and battle actions that had occurred. So each battalion was responsible for submitting a report in a specific format, but we needed 18 copies to be distributed Army-wide. We didn't have Xerox machines. Basically you typed it, and you could produce 6 copies with carbon paper. So we had to retype this document 3 times in order to generate the 18 copies. The other responsibility was, if there was a major contact, the division G3, that's the operations officer at the division level, would say to me, or say to the division historian, "I want you to go out after the contact and figure out what happened and write up the battle." Now, this would be a major engagement for the division, something lasting 2 to 3 days with substantial losses on both sides. And this battle would have occurred over a 2 to 3 day period of time, and mostly at night. So at night, it was extremely difficult to try to figure out what was going on, what happened. So we'd fly out. I would fly out with a sergeant, photographer, and artist, and we would interview the people who were still alive. We would even go back to a battalion aid station and talk to anybody who was wounded, and try to piece the puzzle together, piece the battle together. And I did that on 3 occasions, wrote up the battle program, what had happened. And in one particular case, American company was decimated. It was a company of about 120 men, and they had 80 killed and wounded. So it essentially wiped out that company from being an effective fighting force. Mm-hmm. And when the enemy, and this was an engagement with a regular North Vietnamese army group, not Viet Cong. And when the North Vietnamese soldiers left after the end of the battle, they took all their wounded and dead with them. So there was no body count. Mm-hmm. And body count was the metric by which American soldiers and officers were measured. So in writing the report, I indicated that there was no body count, that we had plenty of blood trails, but the enemy had taken their wounded and dead with them. And the battalion commander and his S3 refused to talk to me, because I was just a lowly first lieutenant, and they were majors and lieutenant colonels, and said, if the G3 wants to talk to us, he can call me directly. So the only person I was able to talk with was the company commander, captain. I tried to tell him that I would report as accurately as possible exactly what went on. All of his platoon sergeants and platoon leaders had been killed or wounded. So, they had really low-level people taking over in the battle. So I wrote up the report and submitted it to the division operations officer, and he threw it back at me and said, any company commander that allows his force to be fixed by the enemy and to lose so many people, that's where the blame needs to reside. Rewrite the report to make the company commander responsible for this loss, and put in that we killed 462 enemy soldiers. And I said, well, where did that number come from? He says, that was the number, 462 enemy killed. So I did what I was told and wrote up the report and submitted it. But as I mentioned, body count was the metric by which officers were measured.
How do you think that affected what we did there, the outcome, how the perception, how it was going, just using a metric like body count? How did that affect everything?
Well, it affected everything dramatically, because in all cases, in all engagements, there had to be body count, enemy body count. If we lost or if we had an American soldier wounded or killed, we had to have a corresponding 10-time figure of enemy killed and wounded.
This particular report that you just discussed, they really made it up. They're like, yeah, 462 or whatever number you gave me. This is such a lesson, like when big organizations go by metrics that don't really measure what's going on, you'll get those metrics, but it doesn't mean you're going to get the results you want, right? You could just say, hey, how many left-handed people did you pass today? 17. And you start making numbers up, and then you start lying to yourself, and like, how the heck are you supposed to move things forward when you're just making numbers up and not only focusing on the wrong metrics, but then making those metrics up when they're not there. That's pretty rough. So how do you know your time in country is coming to an end? What happens there?
When you arrive in Vietnam, you're given a short timer calendar, and it's a drawing of a nude woman numbered into 365 squares. And every man in Vietnam had a short timer calendar. Mm-hmm. And you can guess where number one was. Mm-hmm. So you count down. And as you start getting closer, then as I was a regular Army officer, so I knew I was going to move on to another location after Vietnam. And an officer fills out a form called a dream sheet. You put down where you would like to be assigned. And I put down I'd like to be assigned to the West Coast, mm-hmm. which meant Fort Lewis, Washington, or Fort Ord, California. And I didn't get orders. So I talked my boss into sending me to Saigon for 3 days to buy art supplies and to find out what my orders were. So my sergeant and I had a great time. We did a lot of sightseeing and drank a lot of beer, had a good time. And then on the third day, we bought some art supplies. And I figured, well, I better find out what my orders are. So I kept asking questions, and I got to MACV headquarters. That's Military Advisory Command, Vietnam. And they ushered me into a gymnasium, an actual gymnasium with the hoops pulled up. And on the floor of this gymnasium, there were these low wooden trays. And in the tray, this was Fortran computer processing. And there were punch cards. And every punch card was a soldier in Vietnam. So there was like 500,000 cards on this, or 500,000 cards in these trays in alphabetical order. So we went down the line to A, to B, to BAR, to Bartlett Paul, Bartlett John. And they pulled my card and said, oh, you're going to Seattle, Washington. And I said, Seattle, Washington? Yeah, you're going to Seattle, Washington, Fort Wainwright. And I said, well, wait a minute. I went to high school in Seattle. There's no Fort Wainwright in Seattle, Washington. And we had to get a directory and look it up. Fort Wainwright is in Fairbanks, Alaska.
Wow.
That's, trust me, that was exactly my reaction. I went from 105-degree heat to, fortunately, it was the summertime when I got over there. Got to Fairbanks, Alaska. It was 55 degrees.
Let's rewind a little bit. Do you remember the moment you got in a plane or helicopter and left Vietnam?
Absolutely. Never forget it. Oh, yeah.
Tell us about that.
Well, I again talked my boss into sending me down to the replacement depot early. And I told my parents that I couldn't tell them exactly when I would arrive back at Travis Air Force Base, sometime between May. I went to Vietnam on May the 9th, 1968. And I said I would be back sometime between May 5 and May 11. I couldn't tell them when, because they also had a quota, and the number of Americans had exceeded the quota that Nixon had established. Maybe it was Johnson at the time. So they had to get them out quickly. And so on May the 9th, I was able to get on a plane and fly back to Travis Air Force Base. Arrived at about 11 o'clock at night, and I looked out the window of the plane, and I saw this fence next to the hangar. And on the other side of the fence, there were two people standing there. And I said, those are my parents.
Wow.
And they were. And my father, because he had been in the Air Force as a full colonel, had some contacts, and they met every flight, every Army flight coming out of Vietnam for about 4 days.
Oh my gosh, you're there for 4 days.
For 4 days straight.
That
They
was
met
some good-
every flight coming back. And I kissed my mother through the fence.
Oh my gosh.
I got to within about 2 feet of her before, because we were all dressed the same. I got to about 2 feet of her before she finally recognized me. And I kissed her through the fence. And I, processed through the, everybody else was getting on buses and going to Oakland Army Terminal. I told the officer in charge, listen, I've got my orders. I know where I'm going. My parents are here. And they said, okay, you're dismissed.
Wow.
So I spent 2 weeks at home getting my car ready to go to Alaska and avoiding all of the confrontation that so many of the American soldiers had upon return.
Before we get to that, what was it like getting in the car with your parents? What was that like?
Well, I stayed at the bachelor officer quarters because they were exhausted, but for me, I was still wide awake. And I watched some television, and the next morning I was walking around just getting some exercise, and they have a cannon that they fire in the morning when they raise the flag, and I hit the ground. And then we drove down to our home, which was in Monterey, and my father was driving at about 65 miles an hour, but the fastest I had ever gone up to that time was about 45, and I was scared shitless.
That is wild. And then getting back to what the average Vietnam vet felt coming back. What do you remember? What went through your mind when, these heroes come back, they're defending, our country? Maybe they wanted to go, maybe they didn't, but they did their duty. They put their life in just such harm's way. Some of them just dealing with horrible, just amazingly tough circumstances over there. And then they come back, and then the level of disrespect to some of them. What do you think of that?
I've talked to a number of them, a number of these vets, and they arrived at Oakland Army Terminal, and they threw away their uniforms, and they put on civilian clothes. But I mean, they were still very recognizable because you had practically no hair. The head was shaved for the most part. And they had some really tough times, some very, very difficult times, especially in San Francisco. I mean, because they all wanted to go party, right? And San Francisco is just right across the bay from Oakland. They all went in. They had money in their pocket, and they went to go party. And it just had some very, very difficult times.
For the listeners that maybe aren't familiar with what some of the Vietnam veterans returning went through, what would some of them experience when they're trying to?
Well, the popular opinion in the United States at that point in time had completely shifted, completely turned around. And after that Tet Offensive of 1968 that I mentioned before, the popular opinion was that this was a mistake, and nobody wanted to die for a tie, if you know what I mean. And the popular opinion was that we were all baby killers. And this was after the My Lai incident with Lieutenant Calley, where they murdered hundreds of civilians. And there were other cases, too, that hit the paper. And plus, on a daily basis, they had photographs of every soldier who was killed in Vietnam on that day. So, I mean, we're all getting super tired of day after day after day today with all the Trump activity. And we have Trump fatigue, if you will, just because of all the news. The same was true about Vietnam, especially on the news programs. Every day, they somehow were able to capture the names of the soldiers and get photographs. And at the end of the news broadcast, they would roll this B-roll of all the soldiers who were killed that day. And you got that day after day after day. So the American public just said, enough is enough.
Yeah. Wow. Sorry you guys had to go through that on the way back. I mean, it's so much respect to the job you did over there. So how do you know when your Army service is completely done? You go to Alaska?
So I was in Alaska for 2 years, and I was promoted to captain. Now I'm 24 years old, and I'm a captain in charge of a headquarters and headquarters company. 24, 240 men, $25 million worth of Army material and equipment, all of which was obsolete. And after 2 years, I got orders assigning me to go to the career course back at Fort Benning, Georgia. So on the way to Fort Benning, I stopped in Washington, D.C. at the Office of Personnel Operations. And I met with a major who was my advisor. And he was an armor officer without any combat experience. And I thought that was very unusual to have an infantry officer counseled by an armor officer. And he said, "Oh, Captain Bartlett, we have a wonderful career plan for you. We're going to send you to the career course. You're in the top 5% of your class. And then we're going to send you to the Monterey Language Institute, teach you how to speak Vietnamese, and send you back to Vietnam for your second tour as a Vietnamese unit advisor." And I said, that's not exactly what I had in mind. That's not what I want to do. There's one job that is worse than being an infantry platoon leader, and that is being a Vietnamese unit advisor. Their life expectancy was 30 days. So I said, I don't want to do that. And they said, well, this is what we have you programmed for. And I said, well, I don't wish to be programmed. And he said, well, this is what you have to do. And I said, no, I'm going to resign. I'm going to resign my commission. And he said, well, listen, you have been back in the United States for 12 months. So if you decide not to continue, you're obligated for an additional year of service. So we will reassign you to Vietnam right now. Take the weekend and think it over. That was a rough weekend. Called my father, told him I wasn't going to be programmed, came back Monday morning, met with this same major. And I said, okay, you go ahead and reassign me to Vietnam, but I want my resignation on file for 365 days from today's date. So this major goes and huddles with two other majors. And he comes back and he says to me, well, let's not be hasty. Here the Army has spent all this money to move you and your family from Alaska to Georgia. Well, I was not married and everything I owned fit in my car. But for the first time in my life, I kept my mouth shut. And they said, we'll send you on down to Fort Benning, Georgia, and you can be an instructor or something. They'll find a job for you. And if you change your mind, we'll reprogram you. And I said, okay. So I finished up another 2 years at Fort Benning, Georgia, had a really wonderful assignment there with the leadership department of the infantry school, which is a little bit like the management department of a college. And we developed a course of instruction that was implemented Army-wide called Leadership for Professionals. And I was the operations officer of that group. And it was a very, very satisfying final part of my experience in the Army. And it actually led to my civilian career, which was in publishing.
Congrats on holding your ground there. That's phenomenal. Thank you for sharing that. Wrapping up here, how long did it take you to write the book?
10 years.
Wow.
Because I had a family to raise, and
Yep.
the only time I really had was I had a job that took me on coast-to-coast airplane flights.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd get out my laptop and I would write on a chapter. And it was amazing. My favorite author is a guy by the name of Stephen King.
Oh, yeah,
And
sure.
he wrote a book which was not a horror story, but it was called On Writing.
I'm reading it right now. That's actually the book I am reading. It's in my other bag. I'm in the middle of that right now.
It's a wonderful book.
Yeah.
And in that book, he talks about falling into the computer, or maybe it was typewriter. And what that means is that he became so engrossed in the story he was telling that he blocked out everything that was going on around him. And that actually happened to me as I wrote. And I got so engrossed in telling these vignettes, these unusual experiences that happened to me in Vietnam, that it was amazing how much detail my brain retained. And I could see the colors. I could visualize exactly what happened to me. I would come away from these events as if they had happened to me, and I'd be sweating. I even smelled, a couple of times I even smelled the smells, believe it or not.
Wow.
But that's how I wrote the book.
That is awesome. Robin, first off, the book is Vietnam Combat Firefights and Writing History. Robert, wrapping up here, thank you so much for sharing all these stories. Here's a question I ask all the guests. If you could have everyone listening take just one lesson away from everything we discussed, what would that lesson be?
So today it is very common to say to veterans, thank you for your service. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with that statement. But Vietnam veterans are starting to walk in the boots of World War II vets and Korean vets. And there aren't too many World War II vets left. You'll recognize us because we like to wear our baseball caps with our insignias on it. And my suggestion to anyone who meets a veteran is to say the magic words, which are welcome home, and watch the reaction to those words. It will bring lumps to our throats and tears to our eyes. It's a game changer and so much more powerful than thank you for your service, because it demonstrates that you have an awareness of what it was like for our war.
Welcome home. I think that is about as good as a spot as any to wrap this up. The guest is Robin Bartlett. The book is Vietnam Combat Firefights and Writing History. Robin, first off, welcome home. Thank you for joining us. Honor to have you tell your stories and share your insights in the book. If people are looking for you and your book online, Robin, where can we find you?
www.robinbartlettauthor.com.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to put that into the show notes. And Robin, thank you. Just amazing. People like you are the backbone of our country, and just an honor to have you on the show. Wish you continued success, the book continued success, and appreciate you taking some time to share your story. Remarkable.
Thank you, Joe. Been a pleasure. You're a great host.
Robin, thank you.
Thank you.
You're
a great host. Good questions. You brought me, I've done a lot of podcasts, but we went through it. We covered all the territory. That was really well done. Thank you.
No, thank you. Your story is remarkable. Hopefully I did you justice. And
you did.
Thank you.
Sounds good. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Robin. Take care. Peace out. Appreciate you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.